When I got back from the lawyer's office with the divorce papers in my purse, my mother-in-law was sitting in my living room, rearranging my furniture like the place was already hers. She didn't even stand up when she saw me walk in. She just glanced over her shoulder and said, in that tone usually reserved for dismissing the hired help, "You can start packing your things now. Make sure you leave the condo spotless before you head out." I stopped right in the entryway, took a deep breath, and smiled. It wasn't a smile of defeat. It was the smile of someone who had spent 2 years quietly saving every text message, every bank statement, and every secretly recorded conversation, waiting for this exact moment. Because the condo where she was sitting so comfortably, fluffing my throw pillows and planning her new interior design, was entirely in my name. It was bought with my father's money, well before the wedding, and the deed had never left my hands. The only other person who knew that was my attorney. What they didn't realize was that I was never the naive woman they pretended I was. I stayed quiet for 2 years, not out of weakness, but because I was setting the stage for the moment I could look each of them in the eye and say, without even raising my voice, "This condo is mine. Now get out." But before I dive deeper into this story, make sure you're already subscribed to the channel, because you won't find stories like this just anywhere. And let me know in the comments, what city are you watching from? We absolutely love seeing how far our stories are reaching. My name is Claire. I'm 35, an architect, and I grew up in a family that taught me early on that wealth isn't something you flash around, it's something you protect. My dad built a small but rock-solid construction firm in upstate New York, and my mom was always a woman of few words and deep strategy. I learned to observe before speaking, to plan before acting. That trait, which most people mistook for shyness, is exactly what saved me. I met Bradley on a job site in Chicago, where I was working as a project manager. He was a civil engineer, the son of a highly respected local family, charming in that effortless way that wins you over before you even realize it. We dated briefly, had a quick engagement, and by the time we tied the knot, I was 32 and carrying the naive certainty that I was marrying into a family that would welcome me with open arms. Right before the wedding, my dad bought a condo in my name in an upscale neighborhood like Lincoln Park. It was a high-value piece of real estate, 3 bedrooms, a massive wraparound balcony, and a view of the park that made me breathe a little easier every morning. He made absolutely sure everything was solely in my name, the deed, the property taxes, everything. "This is yours, Claire," he told me. "Not the marriage's. Yours." I agreed, but driven by love and a trust that hadn't yet been tested, I asked that we keep it between us. Not out of deceit, but because I wanted the marriage to start without the heavy baggage of who brought what to the table. I wanted Bradley to love me without the shadow of $1 million property hanging over us. It was the biggest mistake I ever made. Not legally, because the deed was always airtight in my name, but in the sense of establishing a clear boundary right from the start. I only drew that line when it was too late to avoid the war, though just early enough to win it. The first few months of marriage were what most people would call normal. We had our minor friction, the natural growing pains of 2 people learning to share space. Bradley had habits that annoyed me, but nothing deal-breaking. What slowly crept in, almost imperceptibly, was the constant, looming presence of his family in our home. His mother, Eleanor, was a meticulously groomed woman, blowouts always perfect, clothes understated but clearly expensive. She spoke softly and smiled a lot, in the way of someone who learned that a smile is the easiest way to control a room without anyone noticing. From her very first visit, she strolled through the condo with the evaluating gaze of an open house buyer. She ran her fingers over countertops, opened cabinets without asking, and casually pointed out what could be improved. "This paint shade makes the room feel so heavy," she remarked one afternoon, staring at the living room wall I had painstakingly chosen. It wasn't a direct insult. It was the kind of passive-aggressive jab that hangs in the air. You can't defend yourself without looking crazy, but it eats at you anyway. His father, Richard, was a man of few words but heavy authority. A retired CPA, he was used to managing numbers and, I later realized, managing people. Whenever he came over for dinner, there was something about the way he scrutinized the condo that left me uneasy, even if I couldn't put my finger on why. He walked the halls like a building inspector, staring at the crown molding, checking the window seals, testing the balcony railing. Once, I caught him mentally measuring the square footage of the living room. When he noticed me watching, he smoothly transitioned into complimenting the floor plan. He smiled. I smiled back. But my gut filed that moment away. Bradley was a different person around them. When it was just us, he was attentive, even sweet. But the second his parents walked in, he flipped a switch. He grew quiet, overly deferential, like their mere presence activated a subservient setting I didn't recognize. Whenever his mother made a veiled dig at me, he never defended me. He'd just change the subject or stare at his phone. At first, I chalked it up to respect for his folks. Later, I realized it was complicity. Eleanor developed a habit of dropping by during the workweek, not just on weekends. Sometimes she'd text, usually, she wouldn't. She'd catch me in my pajamas on a Saturday morning while I was grinding through CAD drafts, and she'd offer a sickly sweet smile, saying it was good I was resting, because a woman who takes care of herself keeps her man happy. It sounded sweet. It wasn't. Every visit involved the same little ritual. She'd sweep into the kitchen, audit my fridge, and interrogate me about what I'd cooked that week. Once, she asked if I knew how to make Bradley's favorite pot roast, the one she made every Sunday. I told her yes, I had learned it. She paused, gave a tight-lipped smile, and said, "Well, it's cute that you try, honey, but a mother's recipe never tastes the same from someone else's kitchen." That comment stuck with me. Not because it was mean, but because of what it exposed. In her mind, there was a strict hierarchy in this family, and my place in it would never be good enough. The first concrete red flag flew up on a Friday night when Eleanor asked me to sign a paper she called a Condo Association directory update. She slid it across the kitchen island casually, like it was a junk mail flyer. I picked it up, started reading, and she immediately chimed in, "Oh, it's just a formality, sweetie. The HOA president needs it from everyone in the building." I read the fine print. There was a field for primary property owner and another for permanent residence. The name typed into the primary property owner line was Bradley's. I slid the paper back across the marble without signing it. I told her I needed to run it by the HOA board myself first. Eleanor smiled, snatched the paper back, and chirped, "Of course, no rush." But her eyes were dead. And in that exact second, I knew I had to start paying attention to a whole different game. That night, after they finally left, I sat out on the balcony staring at the Chicago skyline, and for the first time since my wedding day, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind off the lake. It was the ice-cold realization that the people I called family were not who I thought they were. And that I needed to stop designing homes for other people and start fortifying my own. From that moment on, I shifted gears. I didn't get paranoid, I got hyper-observant. I tapped into that quiet, finely tuned feminine intuition my mother always swore by. I watched without looking. I listened without asking. And, very discreetly, I started building a paper trail. I downloaded a voice memo app on my phone that was sound-activated. Nothing fancy, but it did the trick. I started snapping pictures of documents left carelessly on my desk, passive-aggressive sticky notes Eleanor left for Bradley before he got home, and bank statements he'd forget to close out on the shared iMac. For weeks, it felt like assembling a puzzle where all the pieces were handed to me out of order. There were fragments of conversations that meant nothing on their own but formed a terrifyingly clear picture once stitched together. Bradley had hired a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, a cutthroat real estate litigator. And the questions he was asking, according to the printed emails I found shoved in his hidden home office drawer, were way too specific to be hypothetical. He was asking how a spouse could lay claim to a pre-marital asset depending on state laws. He was asking about commingling of assets, about sweat equity and renovations done during the marriage, and how the length of the union might sway a judge in a divorce settlement. I remember reading those printouts sitting on the floor of my walk-in closet, the door shut tight so nobody could see me. My hands were freezing. I didn't want to cry. All I felt was this surgical, calculated coldness, the kind that takes over when the threat is much larger than your heartbreak. I didn't say a word to Bradley. I didn't ask a single question. I walked back out to the living room, plated dinner, asked him how his day was, and listened to him drone on about a commercial build downtown like everything was perfectly fine. He talked, I nodded, and inside my head, I was cataloging every syllable, filing away every piece of evidence with the ruthless precision of someone who knows they're going to war. A few months back, Eleanor had pushed hard for us to upgrade the balcony flooring. She nagged so relentlessly that I finally caved, and Bradley had put the materials on his credit card. At the time, it felt like a normal husband chipping in for the house. Now, I saw the math. He was manufacturing a paper trail of financial investment in the property. Sweat equity, like the lawyer's emails had called it. It was a strategic move to build a claim on an asset he had zero rights to. I called my dad that same week. I didn't spill everything, I just told him I needed to review the condo's deed and make sure my legal ducks were in a row. He understood instantly. My dad is the kind of guy who knows that over-explaining is just a form of begging for permission. He connected me with his corporate attorney, a silver-haired shark with a slow drawl who met with me on a Tuesday afternoon and gave it to me straight. The deed is solely in your name, Claire. Because you bought it prior to the marriage and kept the finances completely separated, state law protects it as non-marital property. They have absolutely no leg to stand on. But he also warned me that depending on how nasty things got, they would likely try emotional terrorism and social pressure. Intimidation. Attrition. He told me to brace myself and never give them an inch. I was already braced. All I needed was the patience to strike at the perfect second. And if there's one thing I've always had in spades, it's patience. That second was approaching faster than I thought. Because while I was quietly drafting my battle plan, Bradley and his family were finalizing theirs. And what they completely failed to realize was that I was tracking their every move, armed with a meticulousness they would never have expected from a woman they deemed too soft for her own good. The marriage didn't implode in one explosive fight. There was no dramatic ultimatum, no tearful heart-to-heart. It was like a building with foundational rot. The facade looks fine until one day you lean against a wall and realize there's nothing holding it up anymore. Bradley pulled away. He started coming home later, spending weekends on-site, throwing out vague excuses about client meetings that never used to exist. I didn't press him. Half of me already knew what was going on, and the other half was waiting until my trap was fully set before springing it. Weirdly enough, Eleanor suddenly became super sweet during this phase. She started bringing me fresh fruit when she visited, asking about my architectural firm with fake fascination, and complimenting how beautifully I kept the condo. Her kindness terrified me way more than her usual passive aggression. I knew exactly what that saccharine smile meant. She wanted something. It was my sister-in-law, Chloe, who accidentally handed me the smoking gun. Chloe was Bradley's younger sister, a 20-something who lacked her brother's strategic sociopathy and her mother's rehearsed venom. She popped over on a Saturday while Bradley was working and was acting incredibly overly friendly, carrying the heavy, awkward energy of someone drowning in guilt. Over coffee and mindless chit-chat, she casually dropped the name of a woman, Madison. She brushed her off as a girl from Bradley's office, but her tone screamed the exact opposite. Any woman knows that tone instinctively. She instantly broke eye contact, took a sip of coffee, and frantically changed the subject. That was all the confirmation I needed. I didn't grill Chloe. I just let the conversation flow, poured her a refill, asked about her life, and gave her a huge, warm hug when she left. After I locked the door behind her, I just stood in the hallway for a solid minute. It didn't take much digging. Within 2 days, I confirmed that Madison was real, that she wasn't just a coworker in the traditional sense, and that Bradley had been seeing her for months. But the kicker, the detail that changed everything for me, was finding a chat where he described the condo to her with an intimacy that hurt differently than anything else I had felt up to that point. He talked about the bedrooms, the balcony, the views of the park, like a man showing off a home that would soon belong to someone else. He told her that as soon as the divorce went through, she could move in. He didn't say he'd buy a new house. He didn't say they'd look for a place together. He said she could move here. Into my condo. Like I was just going to politely evaporate into thin air the second the papers were signed. That night, lying in my bed, inside my apartment, next to a man who had meticulously plotted to erase my existence and hand my space to his mistress, I felt an eerie sense of calm that honestly scared me a little. It wasn't resignation. It wasn't emotional numbness. It was the ice-cold clarity of someone who knows exactly what needs to be done and has absolutely zero doubts about doing it. I called the family lawyer the very next day and simply said, "Get everything ready. I'm filing for divorce." I was the one who filed for divorce, and that single preemptive strike blew their entire master plan to pieces in a way I hadn't fully calculated, but that worked better than anything I could have ever orchestrated. Bradley was completely blindsided. He had crafted this whole careful script in his head. I would eventually find out about the cheating, I'd cry, I'd be in a state of emotional shock for a while, and then he would benevolently suggest a separation like he was doing me a favor, liberating me from a situation that was no longer working. And, in his fantasy, I would be the one to pack my bags. He would keep the condo. Madison would quietly move in later, like it was just a natural new chapter in his life. His script never made it to production, because I pulled the floorboards out from under him before he even had the chance to build the stage. When he got served the divorce papers, he called me in a state of genuine shock. His voice was entirely different, completely stripped of that polished composure he usually kept up around me. He babbled about how we needed to talk, how there were things I didn't understand, how the situation was more complex than it seemed. I agreed to meet him, but on my terms, at a time I chose, at a coffee shop I picked, right in public. Neutral territory where I controlled the environment and where any attempt at intimidation would be on full display. He showed up looking way too dressed up for a casual coffee. He was wearing the custom shirt I knew he considered his power outfit, flashing the watch he put on when he wanted to project unshakable solidity. His body language was all business negotiation, zero apology. He launched right into it so fast I knew he had rehearsed it. He claimed the condo had become shared marital space over the course of our marriage, that he had contributed to renovations and furniture over the last 2 years, and that it would only be fair to consider some form of 50-50 split or financial buyout. He kept throwing around words like reasonable and civilized, as if framing his demands in corporate jargon made his attempted theft legitimate. I listened to him without interrupting him a single time. I let him finish completely, let him lay out every desperate argument he had prepped, let him gas himself up enough to actually believe the conversation was going his way. Then, I calmly unzipped my leather portfolio, pulled out a certified copy of the property deed, and slid it across the table. No dramatics. Just paper. The only name on that document was mine. The date of purchase was a solid 6 months before our wedding day. Because we lived in an equitable distribution state, and I had ensured our finances remained strictly separated, a structure he had actually pushed for when we first got engaged, claiming it was more honest for everyone to keep what they earned, the property was a totally protected pre-marital asset. That exact legal structure, which he had demanded 2 years prior with the explicit intention of protecting his own portfolio, had completely bulletproofed mine in a way he clearly never saw coming. I watched the color literally drain from his face. The cocky negotiator vanished, replaced by pure, unadulterated panic, the specific kind of panic you feel when you realize the solid ground you were standing on doesn't actually exist. His arguments about sweat equity and financial contributions were designed for a scenario where the property was jointly owned or legally disputable. Staring at the deed and the reality of sole ownership, all those arguments became legally irrelevant garbage. He knew it, too, because he had consulted a lawyer, and that lawyer had undoubtedly warned him that separate property is separate property. I pulled the deed back, slid it into my folder, and calmly told him my attorney would be in touch with his to hash out the bureaucratic logistics of the split. I stood up, paid for my coffee without rushing, and walked out without looking back once. It was the first time in a very long time that I left a conversation feeling like I could actually breathe. What came next was the hardest part emotionally. Not because the facts were surprising, but because watching the masks fully slip off still hurts in a way you can never completely prepare for. Eleanor called me 3 days after the coffee shop ambush. Her syrupy sweet tone was dead and buried. She was direct, venomous, like someone dropping a heavy act they no longer needed to carry. She told me I was being an ungrateful bitch. That her family had taken me in, that I had lived the high life for 2 years off a marriage they had blessed, and that the only decent thing to do was to resolve the situation with some dignity. I asked her, point blank, what her definition of dignity was. She sneered that dignity meant leaving the condo without throwing a tantrum, that Bradley needed the real estate to guarantee his stability during the transition, and that a woman from my background obviously had somewhere else to go. My family had money, I wouldn't be out on the streets. That carefully constructed rant laid bare the entire sociopathic blueprint they had drawn up. They didn't just want to steal the condo. They wanted to do it in a way that made them look reasonable, almost generous. They would let me run back to my wealthy parents in upstate New York so I wouldn't really suffer. And the property would stay with them by some imaginary divine right they had invented, which I, in the name of peace and dignity, was simply supposed to hand over. I didn't give Eleanor a single reaction other than, thanks for the call. I hung up. Then I stopped the screen recording on my phone and saved the audio file. That phone call, combined with the months of documented passive-aggressive coercion and harassment I had gathered, some subtle, some where the mask slipped and the intention became blatantly obvious, painted a beautiful legal portrait of deliberate intimidation and attempted extortion against a sole property owner. Richard tried a different tactic. He didn't call, he showed up in person. He rang my doorbell on a Tuesday evening, and when I opened the door, he was flying solo for the first time ever, without his wife or son flanking him. There was something infinitely more menacing about that solo visit than all the previous pressures combined, because it meant the group manipulation had failed, and the patriarch had been dispatched to handle the situation man to man, or rather, man to woman, expecting me to cower. He was polite, naturally. He droned on about family values, about what it means to build a life together, and how bitter conflicts destroy things that should be preserved. Then he dropped his voice, using that slow, measured cadence of a man who thinks he's bestowing noble advice, and suggested I think very carefully before turning this into a public spectacle. He said everyone's reputation would take a hit, including mine, and that sometimes the smartest move is a quiet exit. I let him deliver his entire monologue. Then I smiled, matching his polite, corporate tone perfectly, and told him I had thought about it extensively. I told him my decision was to keep what was mine. And that if there was any lingering confusion about what belonged to whom, the county clerk's office and the property deed would be more than happy to clear that up for him. He didn't say a word back. And I knew, by the way his shoulders slumped exactly 1 inch as he turned toward the elevator, that this was the very last bullet in their amicable resolution chamber. What came next would be war. And I was already dressed for it. On the day I came back from the lawyer's office with the finalized divorce papers, I didn't head straight home. I sat on a bench in the park for a while, watching people walk by, trying to process exactly what I was feeling. It wasn't joy, or grief, or even immediate relief. It was that bizarre feeling you get right after a massive storm breaks, when the air is suddenly too clean and you need a second to remember how to breathe without bracing yourself. When I finally walked into the condo and found Eleanor rearranging my furniture with the sheer audacity of someone who already owned the place, I understood their final bet. They had gambled everything on my total capitulation. They figured the pressure, the intimidation, and the emotional exhaustion of a 2-year marriage imploding would have shattered me to the point where I would just pack my bags and walk out with my head down, handing over the keys without a scandal, without a lawsuit, without disrupting the pristine narrative they had spun. I was supposed to be the tragic ex-wife who fled with a broken heart. They were supposed to keep the luxury condo with the park view. That is not what happened. I walked in, dropped my purse on my accent chair, sat down on my sofa, and stared dead at Eleanor with a level of absolute calm that visibly rattled her. She had a whole speech chambered, I could tell by her posture, by the way she squared off the second I walked in. But my silence totally threw off her rhythm. She stumbled, repeating what she had said with a forced harshness, that it was time for me to pack my things and leave, that life needed to move on, and that dragging this out was only going to hurt everyone. I told her I wasn't going a damn anywhere. And that if she intended to stay in my apartment for longer than the next few minutes, she was going to need my explicit written consent, because I was the sole registered owner of the property and she had absolutely zero legal right to be standing in my living room. She let out a nasty, barking laugh, called me a drama queen, said I was just putting on a tough act and that my little bluff only worked on people who didn't know the reality of the situation. I pulled out my phone and dialed my lawyer right then and there, without breaking eye contact, without leaving the room, without a single ounce of hesitation. I put him on speakerphone. His voice boomed through the room, crisp and lethal. The property was legally registered exclusively in my name prior to the marriage. State law completely shielded it from any marital claims. Any individual occupying the premises without the owner's express consent was trespassing and fully subject to immediate legal action, including an eviction and police removal. Eleanor's smug little smirk evaporated while he was still talking. Bradley burst through the door 20 minutes later, clearly summoned by a frantic text from his mother. His GQ swagger from the coffee shop was totally gone. He was sweating, frantic, and tried one last, desperate approach that bounced between begging for mercy and throwing out pathetic threats about making my life a living hell in court if I pushed this. I just looked at him. Really looked at him. I searched his face, trying to find a single trace of the man I had genuinely loved 2 years ago. There might have been something in there once, but it was buried so deep beneath his family's toxic narcissism that I couldn't reach it anymore. And I realized I didn't even want to try. I checked my watch and told him he had exactly 2 hours to box up his personal belongings. Any further communication would be strictly through my attorney, because I was officially done fighting emotional battles over this. Eleanor took one last swing. She grabbed her designer bag, planted her feet in the middle of the room, and spat that karma was going to ruin me. That what I was doing was pure cruelty disguised as legality. I let her spit her venom, and then I calmly replied that I understood she was terrified, and that was a perfectly human emotion. But fear doesn't rewrite property deeds. I told her I highly suggested she help her son pack his bags before I was forced to call the building's security to escort them both to the lobby. Richard, who had slipped in silently behind Bradley without me immediately noticing, didn't utter a single syllable during that entire final scene. When he finally turned to leave, he stopped in front of me for just a second and gave me a look I still can't entirely classify. It wasn't rage. It wasn't disgust. It was the grim, silent recognition of a predator who finally realizes he severely underestimated his prey. I didn't say a word to him. We were entirely done talking. Bradley was the last one out. He stood in the doorway holding a duffel bag he had packed himself, looking around the condo one last time. He stared at the balcony, at the view of the park he had promised his mistress like it was his royal birthright. Then he looked at me, his face twisted in a mess of emotions I simply didn't have the energy to care about anymore. I held the front door open, firm, unblinking. He walked out. I slammed the door shut. I walked out onto the balcony and stood there, looking at the park below, the trees, the late afternoon sun hitting the Chicago skyline exactly the way it did the very first day I fell in love with the place. I stood there for I don't know how long, just breathing. Deep, clean, untainted breaths. No tension. No hypervigilance. No waiting for the next psychological attack. I didn't pop champagne. There was no victory lap. There was only the profound, silent peace of a home that was finally, cleanly, entirely mine again. My mother always told me the difference between a woman who merely survives and a woman who wins is simple: the first one endures. The second one plans. I spent 2 solid years planning in absolute silence. And standing on that balcony, with the wind on my face, I knew every single agonizing second was worth it. Because in the end, it wasn't the deed to the condo that saved me. It was having the crystal clear conviction to never, ever apologize for protecting what was mine. If this story resonated with you, hit that subscribe button right now, because we drop stories exactly like this every single week on the channel. And drop a comment below, what moment made your jaw hit the floor? Oh, and if you want access to exclusive, unreleased stories you won't find anywhere else, become a channel member today. We'll see you there.